G'day frothers, it's Will here from Flow Mountain Bike and welcome to this video review of the 2020 Norco Sight.
I got rhymes in abundance, style over substance. If it's what you like, take the mic from a thumbprint. Coughing up some off the cup with enough stuff to make them out top and rough. Out to rock this, open them up like locksmiths.
Now this is a brand new full suspension mountain bike for 2020. So to start off this video, we're going to go into some detail about what kind of bike this is, what makes it special, and what's changed over the previous version. Then we're going to go into some detail about the specific model that I've been testing here for the past couple of months and how I've set it up. Then we're going to talk about what this bike does well, what it doesn't do so well, and who this bike is best suited for. Before we go any further though, if you scroll down to the video description, you'll see a couple of links in there. One of those will take you to the first look story and video for when this bike launched a couple of months ago. Now that's where you want to go to read about all the specs and pricing on the full range. The other link will take you to the full review of the Norco Sight A1 that I've been testing here. So if you want to know about all the nitty-gritty details about this bike, follow that link to flowmountainbike.com for the full review. So for 2020, the Norco Sight has been completely overhauled. It's got more travel, it's been stretched out and slackened out, and it's got a really gravity-oriented build kit. It's quite a different bike to the previous version. We have a 160mm travel RockShox Lyric fork on the front, and that's plugged into a very slack 64-degree head angle. On the back, we have 150mm of travel, courtesy of a 4-bar suspension design and a RockShox Super Deluxe shock. The seat angle is pretty steep on this bike, 77.3 degrees on the medium frame here, though it does get a little steeper on the larger frame sizes. The seat tube itself is quite short and stout, and that's to accommodate a nice long stroke dropper post. On the medium I've got here, it's a 170mm travel dropper, but once you go up to the extra large, that extends to a 200mm travel dropper post. As for the chainstay length on the Norco Sight, it actually gets longer by 5mm on each frame size. On the medium here, it's 435mm, but it goes up to 445mm on the extra large frame. The Sight is available in both 29-inch and 27.5-inch platforms, and you can get both wheel size options in all 4 frame sizes. Suspension travel, that's identical between the 2 platforms, and geometry is almost identical. And that's partly because the back end of the bike is actually shared between the 29-inch and the 27.5-inch versions. Now there are 5 Sight models coming into Australia for 2020. This sits smack bang in the middle of the range. This is the Sight A1. It's the top of the range spec with the aluminium frame, and it sells for $5,799. For the money, the build kit is absolutely dialed. As mentioned before, we have that Lyric fork on the front, and that has the superb RC2 damper inside. There's very powerful brakes. These are SRAM Code RSCs with a 200mm rotor on the front, I might add. There's a SRAM GX Eagle drivetrain, and we have a custom wheel set here with DT Swiss 350 hubs and E13 rims. And they're wrapped with a very versatile, very popular Maxxis Minion tyre combo. We have a 2.5-inch DHF on the front and a 2.4-inch DHR2 on the back. Now with the heavy duty parts on this bike, it does end up being pretty weighty. Set up tubeless and weighed without pedals, this bike clocks in 15.35 kilograms. Now a lot of that comes down to this very burly frame. Norco claims that the alloy version of the Sight with the rear shock weighs in at 4.6 kilograms. The carbon version does drop down to 3.8 kilograms with the rear shock, but it's still not exactly a featherweight. Now at 175 centimeters tall, I'm riding at medium size in the Norco Sight A1 with 29-inch wheels. Now according to Norco, I'm on the border between a medium and a large, but I'm very glad I went for the medium because this bike is quite big. There's definitely no way I want to be on a bigger frame size, so for those who would normally upsize to get a longer reach and a longer wheelbase, I would suggest taking a closer look at the geometry chart because chances are you won't have to do that with this bike. In regards to setup, Norco's developed a nifty bit of software which it calls Ride Aligned, and this is a setup guide which has been developed for all of the newly released models, including the Sight. You can access the Ride Aligned calculator either on the Norco website or, of course, on a mobile phone app. Once you're in, you input your height, your weight, and your riding skill level, and out will pop a whole bunch of recommendations. You'll have suggested pressures for the fork and shock, rebound and compression settings, even how many volume spaces you should be running. It comes up with tyre pressures and even a guide on how best to set up your cockpit as well. It's a fantastic starting point for getting a new bike set up, and I found a lot of the settings were pretty much spot on. To support my 68 kilo riding weight, I have 80 psi in the fork air spring and 2 bottomless tokens, which come as stock. Rebound setting is a few clicks slower than halfway with 6 out of 18 clicks. High speed compression damping, I've got 1 click off the softer setting. Low speed compression damping, I did play around with that quite a bit. So if I was riding much faster, steeper trails in dry conditions, I'd run the low speed compression about halfway, so 9 out of 18 clicks. But if the conditions were wet, slick, and kind of traction poor, I would back that low speed off just to increase sensitivity and front end traction. As for the rear shock, to hit 30% sag, I have 177 psi inside there and 2 volume spacers as stock. Rebound is 1 click slower than halfway at 6 out of 10 clicks. With the high volume tyres on this bike, you can run some pretty low pressures. So on the front, I have 20 psi, and on the rear, I have 23 psi. Right, so on to what this bike does well. Now I'll admit that it did take me a while to get used to this bike, and part of that is because it is so different to the previous site, a bike that we've really enjoyed testing here at Flow. This bike is quite a bit longer and slacker. It's 2.5 degrees slacker in the head angle. The reach is 30 millimeters longer in the medium 29er sight, and the wheelbase has grown 58 millimeters, and that's a lot. Overall, the new sight has really shifted away from being a trail bike and more towards being a pure enduro bike. It's definitely biased more towards descending, and preferably descending very steep trails very, very fast. With that slack head angle and the reduced offset fork, there is a load of trail on this bike. For those playing at home, it's 135 millimeters, which is a lot. Now, if you don't know what that means, it basically means that the front end steering on this bike is very, very steady and very, very stable. It has a certain degree of damping to the front end steering, and it means this bike is quite hard to knock offline. Because the front wheel does stick out so far ahead though, it does mean you have to get your weight over onto the front of the bike, otherwise the front tire is going to lose traction. Now, to help me get my weight forward, I did drop the stem down all the way, and I also rolled the bars a little bit further forward. I will point out the Ergon GE1 grips on this bike, which are absolutely fantastic. They do support a very defined hand position, so you can actually use those to kind of move you forward on the bike and bring your weight and also your elbows a little bit further over the front of the bike. Once I'd adjusted the cockpit and also my riding style to get further forward on the bike, I unlocked a huge amount of stability in this bike. It's got near downhill-like tracking, the suspension is really smooth, really supple, and it holds its line on choppy, steep, fast terrain incredibly well. Although the suspension design isn't overly poppy, it does give excellent traction. Of course, the Minion tyre combo deserves credit here. These are quite versatile tyres that perform well in varying conditions, and they provide outstanding cornering grip and plenty of stability when you're leaning the bike over. They're not amazing in slick conditions though, was something I found on a day that was particularly wet, riding some really steep, loamy hand-cut trails. But even still, this bike kind of held its ground really well. That long wheelbase and supple suspension design kept it tracking even when the tyres broke traction. Compared to a bike with a shorter wheelbase, it's harder to knock this bike offline, so it's more likely to hold its line rather than spitting you off the side of the trail. The RockShox Lyric is an outstanding performer. This is a very supple fork with great sensitivity all the way through the travel, so even when you're halfway into the travel, it's still ready to absorb that next hit. That RC2 damper gives you a load of control and stability over a really wide range of riding hits and riding speeds as well. The Code RSC brakes are another fantastic addition to the Sight A1. These have loads of power, of course, but it's their modulation and fine-tune control which I found most advantageous, particularly when the conditions were wet and muddy. The bite point at the lever is really solid, and there's plenty of usable adjustability in terms of lever reach and adjusting the bite point. As to what this bike doesn't do well, as I mentioned before, it's less of the all-rounder that the previous Sight was. And that position has been filled by the new Optic, which Norco has given more travel and turned into a more aggressive trail bike. The Sight has kind of recalibrated into more of a pure enduro bike, and this is really built to excel on very steep, gnarly, high-speed terrain. I call it a winch and plummet bike, so it climbs steep stuff well and it descends steep stuff well. On flatter terrain though, it is a bit more hard work, and that's partly because of that big long wheelbase, that slack head angle, and also the heavy duty build kit. With the front wheel way out ahead of you, it can be difficult to weight if the trail isn't super steep and you don't have your weight already pitched forward. So on trails that were fast but were kind of flat, I did have to really consciously get my weight over the front wheel, otherwise the front tyre could wash out very, very quickly and you'd lose all the confidence that this bike has otherwise given you up until that point. Of course, at over 15 kilos, this bike isn't the most enthusiastic climber. A lot of that comes down to the heavy rolling stock. So the wheel set weight is nearly 2 kilograms and each tyre is over 1 kilogram too. So that's quite a lot of mass to get moving every time you want to accelerate going up a climb. However, with that steep seat angle, you're placed into a more efficient and more powerful climbing position. The rear suspension is also pretty efficient too. Norco's built a useful amount of anti-squat into the rear suspension kinematics, and they've given the rear shock a medium compression tune. Now it does have a 2-position compression switch, but to be honest, I never really used it off-road. This bike actually climbs absolutely fine with the rear suspension set wide open. I'd only ever use that lever if I was riding on the road or on a smooth, long fire road climb. Otherwise, there's not a lot of bob out of the back end of this bike, providing you stay seated. Speaking of the rear shock, I did kiss full travel a few times, which is more than acceptable every now and then. But if you did want more progression out of the rear suspension design, it is possible to add tokens inside this air can to give it a little bit more bottom out support. However, Norco does say the leverage rate on this bike is progressive enough that it will accept a coil rear shock. And if you wanted even more big hit capability, the site has been cleared to run a 170mm travel fork on the front. Personally, I don't think it needs it, but hey, there you go. Overall, I think Norco's done a fantastic job of fitting out this bike with the kind of parts that hard-hitting riders are asking for, like the piggyback shock, the Lyric RC2 fork, the Exo Plus tyres, and also the more powerful Code RSC brakes. Elsewhere, there are very few flaws in this build kit. I really like that Norco's used a conventional wheel set build on this bike with standard J-bend spokes, DT Swiss hubs, and hats off to Norco for speccing the faster engaging 36-tooth star ratchet in the rear hub. I also like that we have Ergon GE1 grips, an Ergon saddle and a Deity handlebar in areas where Norco could have saved some money and specced its own brand stuff. I think the Trans-X dropper post was the only unknown quantity on this bike, but it's been totally flawless throughout testing. The lever's kind of big and awkward and feels a little cheap, but otherwise the action of the post itself has been smooth and it's not developed any noticeable play over time. The practical build kit on the Norco Sight A1 is mirrored in this solid, well-built frame. We have chunky forged alloy components on this bike, nice big generous welds, big pivot hardware, and Enduro Max seal cartridge bearings throughout the rear suspension linkage. In fact, on the rear chainstay pivot, each pivot uses 2 cartridge bearings side by side, which is there to improve durability and stiffness through the back end. While I do really like the clean bolt-up axles, what I don't like is the fact that the front axle requires a 6mm hex key and the rear axle needs a 5mm hex key. That's really a mild annoyance, but Norco, if you're listening to this, let's have 1 hex key for both axles, please. The only other thing to watch out for on this bike are the soft E13 rims. The rear wheel in particular is looking a little worse for wear. Now, for those considering this bike, I'd also consider running a tubeless insert inside the rear tyre, and that'll give more protection to the rim and it will also allow you to run lower pressures as well. Right, so the verdict on the 2020 Norco Sight A1. Well, I mentioned before that this bike is quite different to its predecessor, and depending on how you approach things, that's either a good or a bad thing. It's less of an all-rounder and it's not particularly quick up the climbs. It's also hard work to ride on flatter terrain, so if you're not riding in alpine areas frequently, then you may be better off considering the Norco Optic. Overall, the Sight has morphed into more of a pure enduro bike. This is designed to excel on really steep, fast terrain. It's a winch and plummet bike, and if you've got that terrain handy, then this is a very, very capable bike that's also really well spec'd for the money. If you did want to go lighter, there are 2 carbon models above this, and if you've got a smaller budget, there are 2 alloy models below this too. Whichever way you're going to go though, you're going to get a well-built, big travel bruiser that's ideal for pushing your limits and progressing your riding abilities. Now, if you'd like to read the full review on the 2020 Norco Sight A1, make sure you follow the link in the video description below. If you've got any questions for me about this bike, drop them into the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them for you. If you enjoyed this video, give us a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our YouTube channel to be notified of all the new videos we have coming your way in 2020. Otherwise, that's it from me, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. Tooroo.
Verse, I got rhymes in abundance, style over substance. If it's what you like, take the mic from a thumbprint. Coughing up some mark the cup.